Our next keynote speaker is Dr. Caroline Freund, who is Director of Trade and Regional Integration and Investment Climate at the World Bank. She's currently on leave from her position as Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And before that, she was Chief Economist of the MENA, Middle East and North Africa region in the World Bank. She has had a long, distinguished career in the bank and Federal Reserve Board, I believe, before the bank. But on a personal note, I have known Caroline since 2003, I believe, 15 years ago, when I was an intern in the World Bank. We worked in the same department, same division, and have become a fan and follower of her work ever since then. And I never told her this before, but as a female economist, I have a few role models in my career. Two of them are in this audience, actually. Caroline, who is here, and then sitting next to her, Mary. So I'm really delighted to have Caroline here to share with us her insights on the U.S. China tensions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I guess that's what's up there. I have a microphone. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I would say that after the last session made me remember why I love doing research and how much I regret that I don't have that kind of time these days to go into the data in that kind of detailed way that researchers are doing to uncover causal relationships and identification. So I'm going to talk a lot more broadly than that, but about a topic we all know about, and I'm going to try and put it in some perspective about what are the risks, what's happening, why is it happening, and how can we actually move forward. So not just to complain about what's going on or worry about it, but try and be a little bit productive about how we can move forward. So the roadmap of my talk is to start with the backlash against globalization and where it really comes from and what it's kind of boiled down to in the countries where we see it. Talk a little bit about how trade interventions have changed in recent decades. So they're not the trade interventions we studied back in the days of kind of optimal tariffs and so forth. What the trade, how economists model trade agreements and what a trade war means and the risks that are coming with it, and then, as I said, how do we move forward? So let me say a few words about the backlash. The original story that we heard was this is about inequality in jobs in advanced countries. And it's a kind of hexerolene that somehow the rich countries, the low-skilled labor in rich countries have lost as the labor-abundant countries have taken manufacturing and grown. And this was kind of a common story around what's going on. I don't think it's really the right story. And as we've seen developments, it doesn't seem to fit that well what has actually happened. And one point I'm going to show is that a lot of countries experience the same shocks, but inequality has not risen in all advanced countries. So this is a refrain, oh, inequality is rising everywhere. Actually, check the facts. It's not quite true that's what's happened. I think part of what's going on is about the rise of China. And there are some new issues that have come up meanwhile. And the WTO's failure to liberalize. So it had been at least working reasonably well since the financial crisis in terms of dispute settlement, but it didn't make much progress on liberalization. And as we know, if the bicycle doesn't keep moving forward, you can fall off. And so the issues it had settled were the issues of the previous century, And now we really need to get that going again and think about how to handle trade in the 21st century. So this is the first point I said I was going to make, just about different outcomes in different countries. So despite similar exposure to trade and technology, inequality has not gone up everywhere. It's gone up in some countries, down in other countries. And this shows that period of hyper-globalization, the one everybody talks about is changing things from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s. Growth was pretty good everywhere over this period. U.S. did have a rise in inequality, but actually Germany had a bigger rise in inequality over this period. And inequality in the UK, as measured by the Gini index, actually fell. So there's really diverse experiences in terms of inequality over this period, suggesting that policy is much more important as a determinant of inequality than trade or technology. The other reason it's hard to really buy that, oh, people were just getting upset, is American views on foreign trade actually improved. They were at an all-time high. So this was a question, and I don't love these kinds of surveys because, of course, question framing we know matters a lot from the behavioral literature. I guess just as an aside, there was one survey where they asked how you were feeling, and if the question, if you were married, came before it, people were feeling a lot worse than if that question came preceding. But in this case, it's the same survey with the exact same wording given overall. What do you think foreign trade means for America? Do you see foreign trade more as an opportunity for growth or as a threat through imports? And it actually had improved. So it's hard to imagine that this was a big force. Doesn't mean politicians can't build up this kind of talk around trade, and that always happens. Trade is never really a positive subject around elections. But it didn't seem to be at the front of people's mind. And if you look at surveys about what people were thinking about and the topics they were concerned about, it actually was trade. Trade didn't show a big increase. Economy was about the same as years before. The things that did show a big increase were immigration and terrorism. So those were the kinds of fears people were thinking about. Trade might fit in with that, but it doesn't seem like views on foreign trade were particularly negative. The other thing that was happening around the time, of course, was the phenomenal rise of China. So this is measured in real terms, GDP at PPP, which really took off in the 2000s. So this may have changed how policymakers view the world. And let's think about what the instruments were that had come to be important over the period. For people who follow trade, and it only started in the financial crisis, Simon Evenett started monitoring countries' implementations of new trade distortions to see if, like the Great Depression, protectionism might rise after the Great Recession. So he started monitoring every change in trade policy in 2009. And if you look at the main instruments, so Simon loves to talk about how there has been this huge rise in distortions. But if you look at what they are, they're actually export promotion. They aren't tariffs. Very different kind of intervention than countries increasing protection. Rather, countries began supporting exports either because of subsidies, because of export credit, and so forth. So actually, about half of these trade policy instruments were these kind of subsidies, export credits, export promotion type of distortions, not the tariffs of the years before. So let's think for a minute about the economic effects of these and then how that might affect the world economy. Usually when economists think about subsidies, they think about the negatives. So they distort trade and investment decisions because too much is flowing to the firms that are receiving these who may not be the most efficient firms, so your allocative efficiency is ruined because it's not the most productive firms that are now the biggest or the fastest growing. They can cause environmental problems, especially if we think of subsidies to energy, which are common in many countries around the world, less so now, but as energy prices go up, actually one thing we're worrying about is those subsidies coming back. It's easy to cut subsidies when energy prices fall. The real test is what do you do when energy prices go back up. And they may expand the gap between rich and poor countries if rich countries are more likely to have them because they're expensive. So this was the old story on agriculture where the US and EU and others had been intervening in the market at the expense of developing countries who could have exported many of those products. But there are some reasons you may want to have subsidies if you don't think the market's efficient on its own. So if there's some sort of externality with the product that you want to address. So maybe we think that renewables are good for other reasons because they reduce greenhouse gases and slow climate change and so forth, but each private company is only thinking about its own profit. So you may want subsidies to get that greater global good. Anything to do with education, you could argue, may have other spillovers for the economy. So there are some areas where you do want to subsidize, or you might think that it's positive to do so, or maybe to reduce inequality because of, could be on a location basis, that if industry is suffering in some location and we want to help reduce regional disparities. So the difficulty of the fact that there's a lot of really bad reasons for subsidies, a few good ones, is how do you write the rules? How do you write the rules so that we allow subsidies for industries where we want to get those positive externalities, but we prevent subsidies that will distort domestic and especially have any kind of spillovers to other countries. And this has been very difficult. So there's prohibitions in the WTO on export subsidies and on local content rules, which historically had worked well. I think more recently the local content rules, the rules around local content have not been functioning, in part because the WTO isn't as strong as it once was. And where you can see that this is an issue is that when we look at Chinese firms, and this is some work I did a few years ago with Dario Sidhu, who was working with me at the time, what we did was we looked at the Orbis data at the largest firms in the world. So we took every industry and we looked at the top 1,000 firms or 2,000 firms in that industry. And then we looked at the top 4, and we looked at things like whether that industry's concentration had risen or fallen. So in the US, we've heard a lot about rising concentration. When you look globally, which may matter in a world if we think about trade, concentration is actually falling. So what's happened is rising firms from the south have displaced some big firms from the north. And that has meant that inequality globally has fallen, kind of in the same way overall global inequality has fallen, but within country inequality has risen in some cases. So global inequality has fallen. In some sectors, what we find, in some sectors, global inequality in an industry has risen. They tend to be sectors where SOEs are the largest firms. And one of the biggest increases in this case has come from China. So we've seen this rise in industries that they've dominated. You can see these are the top 4 firms. These are cases where countries have superstar firms, so a firm in a top 4 in an industry. And we see a big increase in China's bar, which has come mainly at the expense of European firms. I mean, this is a fixed number since it's 4 firms in each industry, so it doesn't mean their firms have shrunk, just that they're not in the top 4 anymore. And if you look overall at all the large firms, only 41 Chinese firms ranked in the top 1,000 by revenue in 2006. But by 2014, Chinese companies occupied 136 of the top spots, and 70% of these were state-owned. So this was something that affected how people thought about trade. Now, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just a different market structure that is going to affect how countries relate in the world economy. So if we want to think about subsidies, this is an area where there's some interest, especially by U.S., Japan, and the EU, in trying to have a stronger reporting on subsidies. The WTO does require reporting, but it hasn't worked so well. And some solutions might be to have a negative list. So like, there are some sectors where it makes sense to have subsidies and to allow more in some industries than others. And really to start to think about how to have rules around subsidies. And this affects them too, because it's agriculture, it's manufacturing, it's services. All these industries, when there are large subsidies present, it distorts the allocation of resources, which is bad for the global economy. And this is something, as we're trying to coordinate moving forward, and that's what the World Trade System is about, we would want to see more coordination around. So now let me go to how this leads to some rising trade tensions, talking about how economists think about trade disputes and agreements, the effects of escalating tariffs, and then finally how we move forward. So economists agree free trade is best. There's one thing almost all, maybe not every single one, but almost all agree on, it's really that free trade is best. So why do we see this happen? Well, there are reasons that countries impose tariffs or subsidies. So the main one considered in the economic literature is terms of trade reasons. So if I'm a large country and I put a tariff on, I reduce demand for it, and the price of that good, my importable relative to my exportable, goes down, and that's good for me. So I get to import at a cheaper price. I raise the price of the thing I export, so I shift more income to myself. There's also imperfect competition where there may be reasons to put a tariff in order to shift profits towards those firms, or to subsidize as well, as we've seen with Boeing and Airbus. Historically, countries have needed tariffs for revenue, and we still see this in developing countries in many instances. There's one place that's easy to tax, it's at the border. It's a lot harder to tax people's income or within a country where things can happen informally. Special interests may favor certain sectors, certain relatives, so forth, and then you want to help them. And then subsidies may be optimal either because of imperfect competition, as in the case with Airbus or Boeing, or to promote non-economic interests, maybe to do with employment. And things may have changed in a global value chain world. So Paul Antras and Bob Steger have a paper where they look at how GVCs might change the incentives for different types of trade policy, and GVCs, global value chains, might have effects because you may need one stage to get another stage. What you do here may affect there. You may need deeper integration on investor rights and things like that in order to ensure that you want to continue trading. So it might change how the type of policy you want. So when economists think about trade agreements, the way they model them is as a kind of prisoner's dilemma, where you can think of two countries, and these are just numbers just to highlight the idea of a prisoner's dilemma, but no matter what the other country does, I'm going to be better off putting tariffs if I'm a big country, could be for terms of trade reasons. So that's the standard way it's modeled in the literature. For terms of trade reasons, if you don't put a tariff and I do, I get that big gain. If you do put a tariff and I don't, you get it, so at least my putting a tariff makes it a level playing field. So we need to cooperate. We need, just like the two prisoners need to ensure that neither one confesses, in this case, if the countries can agree both to not do any kinds of protection, everyone's better off. So the way countries do this is with a trade agreement where you say, if you don't abide, I'm going to punish you, you're going to punish me, and we're going to end up in the worst scenario forever. And if it's a repeated game, just the threat of that happening is enough to maintain cooperation, so no one ever deviates. So that's the way economists have generally thought about trade agreements as a mechanism to force countries to commit to liberalization, which is actually in both of their interests to do so. The U.S. current administration view seems to be that China hasn't played by the rules. So because of concern over these non-traditional trade policy measures, because it's a different system, the view seems to be, oh, we're playing free trade, China's not. So then what's the strategy? Just by the economic model, one strategy could be, okay, we're going to do the same, that's the threat, and then hopefully we all get back to free trade. So, and I've heard, I'm sure others have as well, senior officials in the administration say things like tariffs are not a solution, they're a tool. So if this is the strategy, there is some economic backbone for it. The danger is that you really get into this bad equilibrium forever, and it's such a risky strategy. And so that's what makes everybody so nervous, is it could really make things much worse off. And it's something that we're very concerned about, and I think everyone is. Where is this going? Is there an end in sight? And so one thing we've done is used a CGE model, the Linkage Model. It's a multi-regional, multi-sector, global dynamic computable general equilibrium model to look at what would happen in various scenarios of trade tariff escalation. And these are kind of medium-term estimates. I don't think of them as long-term or as short-term because we allow substitution from, if there's tariffs on one country, we allow substitution so imports from another country can come in, which might not happen right away. We also allow mobility of workers, but capital's only partially mobile. So it's kind of a medium-term, three-year or so estimate, not what would happen right away. Right away, it would be much more costly than this even because that kind of substitution reduces the costs of tariffs. So we have three scenarios. The scenario of each country doing 50 billion, and then the scenario 2, this work was done before we're in currently kind of a more mid-period escalation than this, just tariffs on everything from both sides. And then scenario 3, where there's a negative shock to investment. And the current recovery in global growth has really been driven by investment. So for a long term after the financial crisis, global investment slowed. It's finally picking up. Global growth is strong. But what do investors do if they aren't really sure about market access? They aren't really sure what kind of effects this is going to happen. They wait. That's what investors do when there's uncertainty. They wait. And if investors continue to wait, this whole rebound could disappear. So these are the three scenarios we consider. And what do we find? We find that the two countries that engage in the trade dispute lose the most because they're the ones where consumers have to pay more. They're the countries where they lose some export market. So the two countries with tariffs lose. In the case where there's no shock to investment, the rest of the world actually gains a little bit. And this is because they can displace China in the US, and they can displace US and China. So trade diversion works in the favor of other countries. But if investor confidence is shocked, and I think there are reasons to seriously worry about this, even as we've seen with gyrations in financial markets and so forth, everybody loses. This is when global growth really slows. And it's, you know, it really is something to worry about in the current scenario where we're sort of, the global economy is coming back. And so this is a very, very risky strategy in order to change the system. So how do we move forward? One thing that's needed is more clarity around US demands. So while US has claimed that tariff is a tool, and it would help if there's some more clarity about what exactly they would like to see done within the WTO for China to do, etc. How important is the trade deficit versus technology transfer? Both kind of comments have come. And resolution will also likely require some action by China. One thing is, it's very important to maintain dialogue. It's worked very well with NAFTA. I think there was many periods when it seemed like NAFTA might not be agreed, but an agreement was reached. And reform is good for China. So we know that too many subsidies in some sectors distort the allocative efficiency. So it actually is part of the strategy they were on anyway. And actually, we've seen tremendous response in terms of lowering tariffs, in terms of opening to foreign investment. So this is clearly the right direction, and it's going to be good for China and good for the world. And mainly, we'd like to see all countries continuing their liberalization programs. One thing I've seen traveling around for the World Bank is that it's confusing to developing countries when they see what's happening in the world, because they've always been told for so many years that liberalization is good irrespective of what's happening. It's good for you. It helps resources go to their most productive uses. But now it's confusing, and some are saying, oh, no, tariffs are okay. And we have seen some tariff increases in South Asia. So I think it really is a concern, and we need to maintain this kind of well-known, we need to keep telling the stories of why trade is good. Countries that have done better have lower tariffs. Sectors that have done better have lower tariffs. People are paid higher wages in open sectors, in exporting sectors. That's where the good jobs are. So it's very important to continue with the types of policies we recommended in the past. And finally, and this is my last slide, one of the things we did was we issued a joint paper with the WTO, IMF, and OECD recently that looks about how to reinvigorate trade. So we wanted to take a positive view, that there are still some channels to improve and open markets. And let's not just talk about trade tensions and get distracted by that, because there are many channels that are opening. And you see it with other countries as well in free trade agreements. So free trade agreements are continuing to grow, they're continuing to deepen. We're working extensively with the African countries on the continental free trade area. So there is momentum going forward, but there's also things that can be done within the WTO. And in particular, there's many different areas where there are plurilaterals. And that's one thing. Maybe now that the WTO has gotten so big, we need to start negotiate through these kinds of joint initiatives rather than trying to do single undertaking, big agreements with everybody. As long as these agreements are open, so anybody can join when they're ready, this will help to allow the system to move forward. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Now we'll open the floor to Q&A questions.
Thanks for the great presentation. I have two questions. The first question is that China has subsidies to its companies. There are many kinds of subsidies. Some subsidy going to the industries, and some subsidy is given to the companies by local government. But also that U.S., Japan, or any other country have subsidy to the industry, like solar energy or electricity cars. So, what kind of principle do you think should be used for in the global economy about subsidy? Where is the line? The second question is that China, China now is very confused about what actions or what request U.S. is asking, because under Trump's administration, it seems like China wants to negotiate, and also under the pressure of U.S., China has already opened and continue opening to the world. Like now, the foreign companies can control the financial companies or automobile industries, but it seems like U.S. don't want to negotiate exactly about what do they want. So it's very confusing. what really they want to achieve in the negotiation. Thank you.
Maybe we'll gather a couple of questions, so Caroline can respond together, or? Oh.
Yeah, hi, Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. Caroline, I'd just like to issue with one of the assumptions that you seem to be saying, that the rise of China somehow has to do with this growing alienation or reaction against globalization. I think that's not quite accurate. China, of course, is being scapegoated for that and is being done so quite effectively, but it wasn't the cause of the problem. Because if you look back, the reason why people today, why you have to have 3 people in the family having a job in order to support the family, why you have kids having to live at home until they're 30 years old, has to do with the discrepancies, I think, between the financial system and the productive economy. And it's been going on for decades, that what has happened is, according to traditional economic theory, your financial system is there in order to promote the expansion of production. But if you look what's happened over the last 40 years, financial system has taken off at the same time as production has been going down, and it has a life of its own. And it's growing, it's getting bigger and bigger. And 2008, I think, was a call to people that now it's come to a point where it's going to be a crisis. And what did we do during this crisis? Did we try and eliminate a lot of this fictitious stuff, like derivatives and over-the-counter derivatives and things that really create fictitious capital? No, what we did is that we bailed out those who were in trouble financially. So you had Bernie Madoff went to jail, but everybody else went to work in Wall Street with their bonuses. And unless that is done, you're going to have this problem regardless of what happens in this trade situation. And if you look what's going on in the U.S., even Trump, I mean, he played this immigration card, cleverly, also a wedge issue. But he also talked about Glass-Steagall, control of finances. And you see this also in the European situation, in Italy and Portugal. They want bank separation. They want commercial banks separated from the casino economy. And that really is the cause, I think, of this alienation, because it's taken away from people who had their jobs and given to them. So you want to comment on it, because I think China is really a red herring in one respect.
Let me start with the second question first. I was not at all trying to say that China was the cause, or that I agree with very much of what you said. I think the point I was making was that this is the way it has been viewed and used, very much in line with what you were saying, by some in what the current economic conditions, in line with what's happened here, have been used to tackle a different issue. And I think it's what I'm trying to get across is similar to what you are saying. What I would like to comment on is the point you made, which I would call, and it was something I was trying to get going a few years ago, it's not trade, it's finance. And I agree with that. One of the research projects I did was looking around the world at how the richest people in the world made their money. And the reason to do that is to think what activities are most well rewarded in a country tells you something about the incentives there and how resources are being directed. In U.S., and this was looking at all the billionaires in the world, in the U.S., the rise is mainly finance, exactly what you're saying, these hedge fund types, etc. Not true in other parts of the world. In China, actually, what we see is a huge rise in founders, the good type of super rich who actually develop companies and products and create jobs. So I think if I gave that impression, I think you just misinterpreted what I was trying to say. That the direction this has taken seems to be less about what it may have began as. And oh, the first question was about subsidies. I couldn't agree more with the speaker, and that, I guess, was the point about some are good and some are bad, and how do you draw the line? It becomes very difficult. So that's where there is this concept of competitive neutrality, and I think I'm probably not the one, but I think experts are thinking about this. And what you really want is a system where countries have enough sovereignty to subsidize the things they care about, but there's enough cooperation so that subsidies don't hurt the competitiveness of firms in other countries. And I think there must be a way to come to some kind of rules around that. I'm sure they're not going to be perfect, no rules are, but my concern is if we don't, things could fall apart. I think it's a very important issue, and I think it's something that's long overdue on agriculture, where really it's the developing countries who've been most affected by rich country policies. And a point we've made repeatedly over the years at the World Bank, we used to have a statistic that the cows, I don't know if this is still true, but the cows in Europe could fly around the world first class on the subsidies that they were given. So.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. You mentioned some aspects of the administration policy, but as I understand it, one of their ideas is to try and reorient global supply chains so that as part of reintroducing manufacturing back into the U.S. And probably reorienting some of those chains away from factory floor of the world in China. How do you see a concept of that as fitting into a concept of globalization?
I will get another question. Nancy.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I don't get to talk to people who speak to policymakers as much as you do very often, so I'm going to ask a sort of annoying question, which is, like you were saying, in the 90s, people, it was pretty easy to go around to talk about things economists believe, which is liberalize, 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 to developing country policymakers. So now, quite often we hear this pushback, or at least my limited experience from policymakers saying, all of this liberalization is really just being used to the advantage of the U.S., right? It's really just it's just about rich countries getting terms that they like at the cost of poor countries, like these trade wars. And sometimes in China, people will mention the Opium War, which is kind of an extreme example. So in this current situation, where obviously the World Bank can't tell the U.S. president what to do, but in this current context, how do you convince policymakers in poor countries that liberalization is still a really great idea and that they're definitely going to benefit from it?
So, one thing we pride ourselves on is evidence-based policy advice. And so we just provide the evidence. So if you look at the countries where per capita incomes have risen, they're countries that have opened up. If you look at the incomes of people, they tend to be higher in the exporting sectors. They tend to be higher in multinational firms. So the best way is just through talking about the evidence. And we understand that countries have political constraints, but they also want to grow. And so I think that point gets through. The other thing I'd say that we're increasingly looking at is the distributional consequences of trade policy as well as trade liberalization. So, with trade policy, often it really hurts the poor who spend a larger share of their income on goods. So that's another way of showing that by reducing tariffs, especially on certain products, you can do well by the poor. But then to consider that if you do liberalize, we've started doing analysis to see who's going to get hurt and prepare for it with either social policies that support people or social policies that support locations that may be very intensive in certain industries. So I think, the best we can do is keep gathering the data, keep creating the evidence, and work with the facts. And then there was a question about global supply chains. Our upcoming WDR, the World Development Report, the flagship report of the bank, is going to be on global supply chains. So I think this is a question we'll try and tackle there. I don't think I can really comment on the U.S. government's incentives around global supply chains. I do think that, like, when we do our CGE model and we think about how tariffs affect the world, we do very poorly at capturing these global supply chains. And so one does have to worry about the effects on the economy of interfering with them, and then understand also the development and spillovers they've brought to many parts of the world.
Any additional questions? Yes.
Hi, hello, my name is Lee, I'm a GW alumnus. Very fascinating presentation. My question is that in addition to tariff and subsidy, market access or the lack of it is also a contributor to trade imbalance, economic tensions. How much do you think, or are there any researches around this lack of market access is contributing to the current U.S. China economic tension? And what are your thoughts about that?
We'll gather one more question, if there is any. Yes, Mary?
So I guess this is a little bit about the future, but as we look forward to types of industries that were featured in Made in China 2025, so industries that make heavy use of artificial intelligence or machine learning, or heavily dependent on global supply chains, electronics, we see a movement to be concerned about security. And so we're seeing an increasing kind of militarization, I think, of the dialogue, where we see the U.S. China trade relationship increasingly viewed as a security threat. And I wonder, is that something that the bank's even on the radar screen yet? It seems to be coming, and one wonders how different regions will align. We saw this week Tim Cook from Apple talking about the need for data standards, data privacy standards within the United States, and aligning himself with the EU standards. And just wondering if we'll see a decoupling or bifurcation of the world for those issues.
On the first question, I think the most important point to remember is that the trade balance is a macro phenomenon. It's not caused by market access. So, you can, a country spends on the things it buys, it wants to consume and invest, and then it produces. Just like your bank account, if you spend more than you produce, you're going to have a deficit, and that's why a country would have a deficit with the rest of the world, not because of market access. So the trade balance is much more associated with the fiscal balance, for example, where if a government is spending a lot and not taking enough in revenues, then some of that's going to be spent on imports. So I do think there's still a market access agenda, and that's why we talked about in the IMF, World Bank, WTO, OECD joint paper about many ways we can still open up, especially on many of the new type areas around digital and so forth. So market access is still very much on the agenda, but it's really about expanding trade which is different from thinking about the trade balance, which is a macro phenomenon. So I would separate those two. They can affect by market access, could affect bilateral, but it would affect bilateral trade primarily. Then in terms of the security question, it's not really on our agenda now. I think if it heats up, it might be in the sense of analyzing how it would affect developing countries. And one thing we're really focusing on is there still an industrialization, manufacturing, export-led growth path, or is that gone? And it could be gone because of security and protectionism. It could be gone because of automation. So there's reasons that path may be premature industrialization. There are reasons that path may be harder than in the past, but that's the angle we would take on it. Thanks.
So unfortunately, we would have to close the Q&A, but we have anticipated